Hey there folks, Wrel here. In the background you'll see some gameplay from PlanetSide 2 as I share some thoughts on better gaming. And today we'll be talking about balancing a game because it seems to be an extremely popular discussion topic in my comments section regardless of what the video is actually about. So let's talk about balance, why it's important, how to achieve it, and the reason your interpretation of it is probably wrong. Balance in any game is the concept of maintaining fairness between each player. Of course, what this actually means is different from game to game. Balancing 3 different factions in StarCraft 2 doesn't mean that each faction should just be able to smash a bunch of units up against one another and then you have the better player come out on top. What it means is that there are viable builds and strategies to be successful regardless of which composition you're up against. So if Protoss doesn't hit their stride until later in the game and Zerg can snowball quickly in the early portion of the game, then Protoss still need to have a viable means to keep the Zerg at bay while they build up their forces. Or else it would just be rock, paper, scissors at the start of each match, and what would be the point, right? In PlanetSide 2, the balancing is much different because it's difficult to balance one strategy against another or one unit type against another because A, no 2 players played the game the same way, and B, numbers are always an unknown quantity. In Battlefield games, you know how many people are on each team or in the server, you know how many aircraft, helos, and tanks can be on the field at any given time, and in PlanetSide 2, not so much. So balancing must be done for the most likely circumstances, and this is where we get into a cyclical balance. Let's say that, what if tomorrow everyone was given a Lancer instead of their standard dumbfire rocket launcher? The result would be that all the vehicle pilots would rage quit because they'd be tired of getting gibbed from any range at all times without a chance to fight back. So suddenly, there would be this huge outcry on the forums and Reddit and wherever else that the Lancer is overpowered, the Lancer needs a nerf, etc., and it would likely get changed. But on the live server, currently, Lancer squads are very rare. Most people are running something else because the Lancer is just something that you have to unlock, and on its own, it feels very weak, very pitiful, and that's a huge turnoff to the average player. And because of that, it's acceptable that they exist in the state that they're in right now. It's not ideal in any respect, but it's acceptable because Lancer squads rarely take place out of organized squads, and organized squads themselves are in the minority. And you might say that, well, Lancers do need to get nerfed regardless because they still cause a lot of problems even though they don't do it that often. And if that's where your mind went, I want to give you another example. Now what if everyone on each server suddenly decided that Galaxies were the vehicle to use because you can crush infantry, you can crush light vehicles, and en masse, they're too difficult to shoot down. And if you have a crew of just 2 gunners, you can do a huge amount of damage over a large area. And this is all completely true, by the way. If you have one squad of 12 players, so 1 pilot, 2 gunners per galaxy, that's 4 galaxies total. 4 galaxies can utterly demolish fights that are under 96 plus with the bulldogs, with the walkers, because they do a lot of damage and you won't be able to kill them quickly enough before they run away and heal up. Again, there would be a huge outcry that galaxies have too much firepower or they're too hard to kill and galaxies should only be transport vehicles. And the funny thing about that would be that galaxies have been the same way for a long time. Nothing about the galaxy itself has changed. So why would they need to be rebalanced if everyone suddenly decided to start using them? And the answer is simple, because their strength would no longer be acceptable to the majority of players. Do you kind of see what I'm getting at here? In PlanetSide 2, there is no such thing as balanced. There's only mostly balanced, or hopefully balanced, or currently balanced, because a lot of what is or isn't powerful depends specifically on server and player culture, and anything can create an imbalance. Maintaining balance is an ongoing process, and it will always be an ongoing process, forever and ever and ever. So in order to balance a game, or in order to provide suggestions that can balance a game, you need to be open to the idea of change. Many players, however, are not. I commonly see players with an extremely parochial mindset regarding what is and is not powerful because their thoughts on balance are based entirely on what they themselves experience, what they play most often, what they see on the field the most, what excuses they can come up with for why another faction is overpowered, or excuses why their weapons suck or why they always die. The grass is always greener on the other side, and that mentality is derived from a lack of perspective on the game as a whole. I can't even keep track of how many comments I see that say, TR is the worst faction because our weapons do the least amount of damage, or NC is the worst faction because all we have are shotguns, or VS is the worst faction because the other two factions either do more damage or fire faster than us. And all of that, all of it, is laughably wrong. It's not even subjective, it's very literal. Look at the numbers of each weapon, look at what kinds of weapons you have access to. Try to at least educate yourself a bit before you open your mouth. And the worst part of all of this is that the people who complain about something, be it a weapon, a unit, a faction, likely have no experience with it, or at the very least they'll have dipped their toes into the pond just to reaffirm their initial bias instead of giving it a real shot, giving it a real try. When you balance a game, you need to be able to look at it from many different angles. You need to broaden your perspective, and no one will get it right all the time because no one sees all sides of the same box. All we can do is take in the feedback, weigh it against possible conflicts, and try to filter out as much bias as possible. One of the easiest ways to visualize this process is to group like things with like things. If something is out of whack, you need to look for causal implications, not only within that group, but elsewhere as well. Then you propose a balanced solution and weigh the impacts of that solution on other groups. Let's take ravens for example, because people seem to be really keen on that. If I have 3 weapons that are supposed to perform a similar role, so fractures, vortexes, ravens, all of which are your long-range AV weapons, when I see that one of them is overperforming in comparison to the other 2, I can ask myself why that might be, and then I run through a huge list. I can be really abstract and ask, is it because NC usually controls continents with a max resource reduction? Because that would naturally lead to more max units being pulled, which would help explain the almost double infantry kills per hour and 30% or so increase in vehicle kills per hour that they have over the other 2 factions. The obvious answer to that is no, because VS are winning close to 50% of the alerts across the board right now. Or I can be less abstract and just use some common sense. It's obviously not solely due to the render range advantage or even the effective range, because the VS vortexes get that too. It's obviously not solely due to the ease of use either, because again, vortexes are pretty much point and click, and fractures with their lower accuracy overall are statistically on par with vortexes currently. But what your ravens do have over vortexes are the overall damage output on top of their ease of use and accuracy and range advantage. So now that I think I have a reasonable case for why the weapon is out of whack, I can make a decision as to whether or not the other 2 weapons in that group need to be lifted up to the Ravens level, or if the Ravens themselves need to be toned down a bit. And to do this, you'd compare them against their desired role, which involves comparing them to the Generation 1 weapons. So what are my Ravens supposed to get over my Falcons? I have a range advantage, accuracy, sustainability, in exchange for less damage output. Do they accomplish this goal? Yes. Do they intrude on what my Falcons bring to the table to the point where Ravens are no longer a niche weapon? Also yes. So the verdict would be that we need to reel Ravens in a little bit. That doesn't suddenly exclude the buffing of other faction weapons, but you also need to do a separate analysis to determine how much they are lacking in comparison to their competition. Now that you've got the direction that you want to take the weapon, as well as the reason it's overperforming, you have to figure out which solution you'd like to try. And usually, there are 100 different ways to solve the same issue. You can give them a cutoff range, you can lower their damage output, you can lower their reload speed, you can lower their magazine size, you can remove their splash damage. Many ways to address the same problem. But the goal you should shoot for is to make sure the weapon is still both enjoyable and viable after you're done messing with it. What's interesting about that though is that there seems to be a stigma attached to the word nerf that immediately turns people off, immediately pushes them away, because nerf is negative opposed to buff, which is positive. But how you should be thinking about a change is just that. It's a change, right? It's a balance decision. Yes, it can still be a nerf, but a nerf does not mean that something is immediately ruined. In the Raven review, for example, I recommended increasing the reload speed from 1.5 seconds to 2.5 seconds, and there was a huge outpour of comments along the lines of, sure, nerf the only useful thing the NC has, or if you nerf Ravens, NC will be the worst faction, or other ignorant garbage like that. But whenever nerf takes place, there's usually this period where people are doing the whiny bit I just mentioned, because for whatever reason they can't do math, or they can't visualize the change in their head, or they don't really understand the reasons for the change. They'll instead take the easy route and rebel and moan and cry, because that's much easier to do than taking all the pieces and trying to put them together. After that goes on for a bit, and if a nerf actually passes through to the live server, the people who are actually experienced, educated, level-headed, and understanding of the change can say, now this works just fine, and they'll continue to play with it. And eventually, the people who had the initial knee-jerk reaction will come back around, because other people are using it, so I guess I should too. If you want to talk about balance and be taken seriously, you have to learn to think for yourself. You have to make the changes for the right reasons, and you have to be able to back up what your reasons are. When you think that your weapon shouldn't be nerfed because the opposite faction has X, Y, or Z which can be completely unrelated, that's not a good reason. TR has Vulcan harassers, therefore Max Ravens deserve to be overpowered. Yeah, that's wrong. When you feel some grave injustice was thrust upon you and now it's time for vengeance, that's not a good reason either. VS had a ridiculous broken Zoe for 6 months. Therefore, Strikers deserve to be overpowered for 6 months. Yeah, not exactly. You do not create balance by causing imbalance. Balance is something that needs to be done for the betterment of the game as a whole, not so that you can power trip all over yourself for a couple of months. And these examples, by the way, have nothing to do with asymmetrical balance, which I could see being an argument. Asymmetrical balance is very different. One faction having something overpowered does not mean that another faction should have something else that's overpowered. There's a distinct difference between overpowered and strong. Shotgun max units, for example, are a faction-specific strength, and because of their dominance in close quarters, doing battle against them needs to be handled in a different manner than you would have if you were fighting TR or VS. Likewise, shotguns not being able to fight well at longer ranges is a faction-specific weakness, which is overcome by learning how to close the gap. Now, if the shotguns themselves are too powerful, or if closing the gap is too difficult, or if the other two factions don't have appropriate counters to whatever your strength is, then that's a different balance discussion entirely. Asymmetrical balance is the act of creating strategies that differ from one another based on the strengths and weaknesses of your units, your items, your abilities. It's not necessarily the fact that one item is stronger than another. They are completely different concepts, and even though they intertwine, it's important to know how to make the distinction. Another poor way to approach a balance discussion is to redirect blame to what is beyond reason. Now let's say that infantry AV is too strong at range. AV monoturrets, lancers, whatever, doesn't matter. You don't say, well, it's the render distance that's the problem, it's not the weapons. Even though the render distance is indeed a huge problem, that does not excuse the current imbalance within your rule set. And you can imagine render distance as being part of the game's rule set because it's a technical limitation. That doesn't mean that it won't be fixed later on down the line, but it's certainly not something that they can wave a magic wand over. Think about this for a moment. If it takes you 6 months to fix render distance and 30 seconds to reduce the maximum range of an infantry AV, what do you think should happen first? Or if vehicles are spawn camping infantry left and right, but it's the poor base design that's definitely at the root of the problem, we need to ask what changes can we make to alleviate the current problem while we spend the next year redoing all of our bases. When something is out of whack and it's a priority, you need to know how to make adjustments within the current confines of the game, instead of creating a new problem that you'll need to solve. A lot of these, well, just fix render range suggestions come from a general lack of understanding, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not so keen on the process either, because I don't work for Daybreak. I'm not on their team. I don't help design their game. But what I do know, or at least what I think I know, from listening to devs and reading all the same stuff that you all have access to, seeing all the same answers that you all see, is that there are two ways to make changes to the game. You either require code, or you don't. Code time is rare, expensive, and needs to be put toward high priority stuff. But changes without code are done through the database. This is the tweaking of values, and it's stuff that all developers there can do or learn to do. But all the developers cannot also make heavy code adjustments. An example of an easy change, something that doesn't require any code time at all, would be to lower the amount of explosive damage your rockets do. This is an easy change. It's done right from the database by tweaking some values. Now here's an example of a more difficult change, something that does require code time. That would be lower the amount of explosive damage your rockets do the further away from you they are. So basically, as they travel, their indirect damage gets reduced. This is a feature that's not currently supported, meaning that it would require code time, even though it sounds really simple. Code time means that it requires a specific individual, opposed to whoever felt like balancing the weapon. And like I said earlier, a lot of these seemingly minor differences come from a lack of understanding. I can't tell you how many times I've had ideas that I felt could solve a problem or revitalize the game, just to hear back that they are way outside the realm of feasibility because of how much time and resources it would take. That's actually why I did the doing more with less video in the first place, because it offered ideas that I believed could be achieved within the limitations that devs were facing at the time. And that's one of the many reasons that it's so important to be open to change, because we can never know everything. We only know what we see. We gather as much information as we can, and we make interpretations based on what we've put together. If this video has been interesting, helpful, or entertaining, please feel free to like, subscribe, tell your friends about the channel. And originally, I was going to try to relate this to life because there are most certainly connections between the way we tend to stonewall information for the sake of protecting our own beliefs, or the connections to confirmation bias or attribution error, all sorts of fun stuff worth exploring, but this video ended up way longer than I set out to make it. So in addition to the standard comments section content, I would also be interested in hearing how you guys can interpret and apply the information in this video to your life, be it yours or just life in general. Thanks very much, folks. Wrel signing off.